So let's start here with how the pandemic reshaped Disney's Animal Kingdom during the first few months of the outbreak, back in the spring of 2020, when all the parks were closed to guests. During these months, when most everyone was trying to understand the nature of COVID, the Disney Animal team worked in small groups, roughly one-fourth the size of their regular work groups, to limit contact. Beyond Animal Kingdom, this was also true at the Seas Pavilion at Epcot, the Savannas at Animal Kingdom Lodge, and also the barn facilities over at Fort Wilderness. In small groups, animal caretakers wore masks, face shields, and goggles. They watched to limit exposures with other cast members to no more than 15 minutes. In those early weeks of the pandemic, Disney was not only concerned about asymptomatic cast members infecting other cast members, they were also concerned about the possibility of asymptomatic cast members infecting the animals. After tigers at the Bronx Zoo were diagnosed with COVID, Disney contacted workers at that zoo to explore how a similar outcome could be avoided at their park. For months at the Animal Kingdom, workers let the animals out onto the savannah. As usual, only there were no safari vehicles circling. Most animals still received half their food portions on the savannah, half in their barns. In the evening, they were called back to the barns with their regular audio cues. Back then, Mark Penning, Disney Parks VP for Animals, Science, and Environment, explained, quote, "We're trying to keep the same routines, same times that we feed. We provide enrichment for them to keep them thinking and doing different things." At the savannas over at Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge, they did the same. They placed food around the savannas, they called the animals into their barns. Some animals responded to sound cues, others to visual cues, and a few to scent cues. Handlers noticed that the area was amazingly quiet, without guests, without music, without much traffic on outside roads. Quote, "The savannas are empty," Penning explained. "There are not a lot of trucks coming through, and so we're going to have to acclimate them again." On the Kilimanjaro Safari area, the only trucks the animals saw for weeks were those that carried food and carried the caretakers. During these months, the presentation of the park changed as well. Though animal caretakers came to the park, most of the groundskeepers and members of the horticultural team were kept on furlough for nearly 4 months. With spring rains and the warmth of the season, plants exploded into bloom, growing out into the walkways and driving paths. For the first time, Animal Kingdom appeared genuinely wild. Quote, "There's no horticultural team trimming away the vegetation," Penning said. "The vegetation is really full and lush and beautiful at the moment. The park is filled out. There's blossoms everywhere." And then, toward the end of June 2020, in the weeks leading up to the reopening, cast members at Animal Kingdom cycled the safari vehicles without visitors back through the savannah to acclimate the animals to regular park operations. They also cycled the Wildlife Express train around its circuit from the fictional settlement of Harambe to the Planet Watch destination and back. This train passes very close to the rhino, cheetah, and elephant barns. This, too, was an adjustment. And then finally, on July 11th, Disney reopened 2 of its parks to the public. They opened Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom. 4 days later, they opened Epcot and Hollywood Studios. But for months, many hotel areas remained closed, as did the water parks. And even as other areas reopened, some experiences at the parks remained shuttered. Today's episode is something that we haven't done in a long time. For recent subscribers, today's show format will be new. A long time ago, back before the pandemic, every so often, we explored tucked-away experiences at the parks. The assumption was that if you're listening to this podcast, you've probably visited the parks many times, and this sub-series was a way to keep the parks fresh and interesting for you. We explored everything from experiences that were free, such as how do you find locations in Florida that were familiar to Roy Disney, Dick Irvine, and other early designers, to experiences that were expensive. The entire ongoing series is archived over on Bandcamp with the call letters AGD. But for the last 2 years, the parks in America and around the world have struggled to offer basic services as they recovered from the pandemic. But a couple of months ago in February, this began to change. Of the dozens of Backstage Tours that once used to circulate regularly through the American resorts, Disney reopened 4 at their Florida resort. These were arranged mostly as outdoor experiences or in open-air trucks. And then, in what was casually called Phase 2 among cast members, they opened a 5th tour. I've been on all of the revamped tours now. I should point out for clarity that Disney has only reopened such tours in Florida, not California. In this subseries, we typically cover a lot of things. First of all, we use these experiences to talk about the history and inner workings of the parks. If you want to know a little bit more about how Disney runs its Florida parks, we'll talk about that today. Then there is background and details, such as how do you tell a new story in an existing attraction area only by adding light? Next, for armchair travelers, I'll walk you through the key moments of each experience so you can sample them from the safety of your earbuds. And lastly, for vacation dreamers, this should give you an opportunity to consider many things you may or may not want to try on your next trip. So now we're going to reach back and retrieve a sub-series that used to exist here, long before the pandemic, our AGD sub-series, which long ago, sort of tongue-in-cheek, meant Advanced Guide to Disney. Experiences for those who have experienced nearly everything. So a long time ago in this sub-series, we broke down how different management lines handled work differently in different divisions out at Disney World. And each division has its own traditions, culture, and emphasis areas in terms of how they arrange their tours. That is, each division has their own style when developing tours for the public. And I realize that some of that information may have been left behind in our pre-pandemic minds. So here's the short version. In Florida, most backstage tours are handled by guest relations. A smaller number of longer or more extensive backstage tours are handled by Adventures by Disney. Occasionally, members of the horticultural team handle a tour based on gardens at Disney World. And lastly, a handful of regular tours, mostly at Disney's Animal Kingdom and the Seas Pavilion, are handled by Disney's Animals, Science, and Environment team. The big difference is this. Tours led by Guest Relations and Adventures by Disney typically rely on a script. Guides can go off script to add more color or details, but most tours led by the Animals, Science, and Environment team typically bring you in contact with individuals who work with the animals and their environment, from trainers who work with dolphins to caretakers for large animals such as rhinos and elephants. In this episode, we'll focus on experiences that generally fall under Animals, Science, and Environment. And these tours range between the modestly inexpensive, such as $35, to the modestly expensive at $199. And just a heads up, the most expensive option here is by no means my favorite. But more on that in a bit. And one more thing I forgot to mention up front. These AGD episodes typically explain how to sample aspects of these tour experiences without paying for the entire experience itself. And so let's start there with Starlight Safari at Disney's Animal Kingdom Lodge, a tour where you take night vision scopes out into the savannah areas behind the hotel. For years, Kidani Village at Animal Kingdom Lodge had a free program that allowed guests to try out night vision scopes. Cultural representatives placed a couple of night vision goggles around the Savannah Overlook Fire Pit area behind Kidani Village. That's right outside of Sanaa, for guests to use as they liked. But with the pandemic and with concern about contagion, that program stopped for a while. This past winter, the resort brought back the program, though this time it wasn't run by cultural representatives. It was run by the animals team toward the end of their primary shifts. But as sunset moved later in the day, the night vision program was again canceled because without cultural representatives, the resort didn't have enough staff at night to manage the program. I can tell you that during this past month, the first invitations went out for cultural representatives to return to Epcot. The resort isn't yet at a point where they are inviting representatives to return back to the Animal Kingdom Lodge, but that's now likely in the near future. Hopefully, once the hotel is more fully staffed, the free night vision program will return as well. And once cultural representatives return, you'll hopefully have an opportunity to wander up behind the lodge, pick up a night vision scope, and peer out at the savannah, where, with luck, you'll see zebras, giraffes, and other animals bathed in the green light of a night scope. A lovely evening, I think, would be dinner at Sanaa and then spending some time in the fire pit area just outside the restaurant, watching animals in open areas just beyond the walkway. But again, this experience hasn't yet returned year-round. But there's a longer, more extensive night vision experience that reopened a couple of weeks back called Starlight Safari. I was out there at the lodge for the very first nighttime excursion in over 2 years, which included a ribbon-cutting ceremony. In theme park communities, I feel like we've become accustomed to discussing park experiences as mostly back to normal. And that is largely true for centerpiece experiences at theme parks, the attractions, most of live entertainment, parades, and even character interactions. But still, many of the specialty and small group experiences are yet to come back. And so when one does, there's usually a small celebration. When we arrived at Kidani Village on Earth Day, April 22nd, we found the open-air safari truck parked near the entrance, but across its boarding ramp was a peach-colored ribbon and a bow. And then came out a 2-foot-long pair of ceremonial scissors for an intimate reopening ceremony. I do have some audio that I captured of the event. The levels, I'll point out, are a little low, so lean in for just a moment. The clip is short.
Welcome. Thank you all for coming on our first Starlight Safari. Since you are our first guest, we were hoping we could do a little ceremonial ribbon cutting for the truck, getting it back in action.
Ready?
Wait, we're getting all of our cameras in position.
I'm the unofficial photographer. Unofficial photographer. Here we go.
1, 2, 3. Yay!
And once the ceremony was over, once night vision units were distributed, and the safety spiel was finished, we were ready to see some animals.
Alrighty, awesome. Perfect. Alrighty, driver Emily, I think we are good to go.
The Animal Kingdom Lodge complex has 6 savannas arranged into 2 clusters that are separate from the animal exhibit areas at the theme park. There's a road, a lot of land, that separates the park from the lodge. The animals can be transported from one area to the other, which happens at times, but for the most part, these are discrete communities of animals. The truck carries you through the 6 savannas, stopping so you can view the animals. Each person has a night vision monocular, which presents the nighttime world of the savanna with that green tint. But the night vision monocular isn't always necessary, as the savanna areas are lit with carefully hidden light banks. If you've ever stayed at the Animal Kingdom Lodge out by the savannas, you might have noticed that the animals are fairly easy to see at night. This is because along the roofline of both Kidani Village and Jambo House are lines of carefully integrated light banks. You'll find that these light banks are angled out toward the open areas. So as not to interfere with the sleep cycles of the animals, the light value from these banks are arranged to imitate the evening light of the African moon. Guests inside of their hotel rooms likely never realize that along the roofline of the lodge building are lights creating an endless illusion night after night of an African savanna burnished by a full moon. The truck is an open-air vehicle, essentially benches with safety rails and a roof. and a driver takes you one by one through the lodge areas while another member of the animals team explains what you are seeing. But this idea of light, specifically of man-made light to imitate specific ranges found in nature, is an idea that I want to return to a few times today, as a way of tying these experiences together. But before I move on, the Starlight Safari books up very quickly. You can book 60 days out, and as I write this, every spot on the safari is taken for the next 54 days. The experience runs $89 per person, and Disney offers the usual discounts for annual pass holders, DVC members, Disney Visa holders, and other groups. In a similar fashion, over at the Animal Kingdom theme park, there are 2 tours that take guests backstage to explore animal care areas and to talk with members of the animal care team. So back at the beginning of this episode, I discussed how the structure of Backstage Tours varied depending on which division was giving the tour. Backstage Tours at the Magic Kingdom are given by cast members in guest relations who, ideally, have a working understanding of how designers have created the theme space inside the park. But on a guest relations tour, you will not meet a designer or talk with anyone who manages lighting, sound, or animatronic systems in the park. But the Animal Kingdom tours are arranged so that you spend time not only with a guide from the animals team, but also with those who care for the animals, typically with years of experience caring for specific species. The 2 tours that most closely fit this model are Caring for Giants and Up Close with Rhinos. I've been on both of these tours many times, including during the past month. Let me set it up for you, as both of these tours share many elements. They both start out the exact same way. Whether you're visiting the elephant observation area or the rhino barn, you begin these experiences by walking back through the cast member entrance behind Tucker House to the vehicle maintenance lot. This is an outdoor space where the various shuttle vans, cast member vehicles, and the Kilimanjaro Safari vehicles are stored. The buildings that connect to show areas, such as restaurants and shops, are traditional structures with finished exteriors and paint, but just a few feet into backstage areas, you'll find work buildings whose construction is far more makeshift than anything on stage. These buildings are a combination of temporary structures and corrugated metal warehouses. Long ago, Disney learned not to build expensive structures immediately outside of show areas in case, in a few years, the buildings need to be moved or torn down to make way for future park expansions. Buildings on stage might cost millions, and some buildings backstage might only cost $30,000 or $40,000, depending on their size. In this, the lesson is very clear. Spend money where guests can see it, not where they can't. You'll make your way back to a small tour bus that will take you to your destination, around the backside of the safari area. One of the first things you'll pass just outside of the main savannah is one of the most unusual structures on Disney property. You'll find the sunset lights hidden behind the safari. And it's possible that your tour guide won't even point them out. Picture a cluster of high billboards arranged at different levels, hidden behind a thicket of trees. On the front of each board is a band of lights, with the top of each board camouflaged by artificial vines. Inside the safari area, these are well hidden. Backstage, they're easy to spot, a set of boards supported by green steel girders. When turned on, these lights radiate colors of the sunset, the electric colors of juice hidden behind branches. These lights, years ago, allowed for effective night safaris. Decades ago, in 1999, that was the park's second year, Disney experimented with dusk safaris at Animal Kingdom, but without lighting that allowed guests to effectively view the animals. This experiment played out over the winter holidays for just 1 year. It was a way to add capacity to the attraction during a peak period of visitation. Under ideal conditions, it was a way to view nocturnal animals such as African wild dogs, hyenas, and lions. But it played poorly with guests, as they were in a safari truck unable to see much except for what was in the driver's spotlight. Often that was nothing more than dirt or a clump of grass. Then that concept went away for years. Quote, "The lack of technology to be able to light that safari at night in a way you have normal animal behavior, reasonable guest visibility of these animals, it just wasn't physically possible," explained Imagineer Joe Rohde. Once that was doable, it opened the door for everything else. The opening of this door was a period of experimentation that lasted years. Back when an Imagineering team first tested lights for a nighttime safari, they tried Xenon Arc Lamps. These are fairly large bulbs in which electricity passes through xenon gas inside the bulb to produce a quality of light that closely resembles that of the sun. But xenon lights don't have a dimmer function. They are either on or off. They don't mimic atmospheric changes in the environment. As tests continued, the xenon lights were replaced by LED lights that allowed the team to gradually engage them with brightness. Over a 30 or 40-minute cycle, the LED lights could increase in intensity and color shift to mimic the changing light patterns of an actual sunset. These lights would continue to stay on after the actual sunset ended, slowly deepening in color over hours to create an extremely long artificial sunset. The sunset lights, long into the night until 9 or even 10 p.m., offered the citrus-colored hues of an actual sunset. The savanna area where these sunset lights are positioned is in one of the early sections of the safari. In this is a narrative told only with light. You begin your trip with the colors of sunset, but as you continue further into the attraction, those sunset colors fade away and are replaced by the colors of moonlight. First, you experience early evening moonlight, which is typically more buttery, then later the paper white light of a moon high in the sky. All of this, of course, is done with light fixtures. By the time you've gone through the 17 or 18-minute safari, you have experienced hours of a moon cycle. The quality of moonlight a couple hours after sunset has been shown to make people feel sleepy. So if you went on the sunset safari years ago while at Animal Kingdom and stepped off the attraction feeling a little drowsy, this is why. The change in light, from sunset to early moonlight to late night moonlight, told your body that on this short adventure, you had moved through half of the moon cycle, and now it was the middle of the night. The LED light boards backstage are huge. I've been told that each individual LED panel is close to 1 foot square. Hundreds are arranged to make up the boards. During an extended phase of testing early on, technicians and the animal care team experimented with different light levels and light patterns so that the lighted areas were more visible to guests without interfering with the circadian sleep rhythms of the animals themselves. When the park ran night tours with light patterns that imitated a longer sunset schedule, they let some of the animals sleep, or at least have the opportunity to sleep in their barns, later into the morning, before they were called out onto the savannah again. And for those of you who are thinking broadly, I should probably point out that this is not the only place on property where light enhances outdoor show elements as day shifts into evening. And maybe a little context here is helpful. In the 1950s through the 1970s, Disneyland, the Magic Kingdom, and Epcot were largely designed by artists whose background was in film production. They were focused essentially on creating areas that resembled backlot-style sets. But then, in the early 1980s and expanding out into the 1990s, Imagineering broadened its scope. One of the new areas from which Imagineering drew hires was from the world of theater. This included people such as Joe Rohde, who oversaw the development of Animal Kingdom, and Alex Carruthers, who for years was the art director for the Magic Kingdom. With this wave of hires came individuals who specialized in light design for theatrical productions, and this type of lighting began to transform the parks at night. Beyond the sunset boards at Animal Kingdom, light technicians created similar effects on elevated park icons throughout the resort, such as the Castle, the Tree of Life, Everest, and Big Thunder. But it's something that most visitors don't realize, as it enhances light patterns found in nature. For example, the west-facing section of the Big Thunder mountain range during the evening is lit by yellow and orange lights to visually amplify the sunset. The backside, however, facing away from the sunset, is lit with darker red and purple lights. This, of course, deepens the effects of a natural sunset to make the landscape more dramatic. The application at Kilimanjaro Safaris, though, is a unique application of this effect, or I should say, was a unique application. The sunset tours haven't run since the pandemic. In part, Disney World has hired many new cast members in the past 2 years since reopening, many of whom would need to be retrained to run nighttime safaris. At the moment, safari tours end when the sun goes down. I have been told that WDI has tested the lights since the pandemic, but they haven't been turned on for the public. In addition to retraining all of the drivers for nighttime safaris, I should point out one other challenge. Disney knows through internal surveys that guests who experience the nighttime safari after visiting the daytime safari enjoy new sights on the evening excursion, including animals such as hyenas, which are far more active after sundown. But those guests who first experience the safari at night are often disappointed, as many animals have returned to their barns to sleep. To have night safaris requires not only the retraining of drivers, but also an effective communication campaign with guests to explain that the daytime safari is a far better place to start, and the nighttime safari is better for those who have already experienced the attraction during the day. But that discussion moves us away from the focus of this episode, which are the backstage tours. Once you are on that transport bus, you are driven on a road that outlines the back portion of the safari area. You pass the tree farm, which provides plants for the entire resort, including topiaries and floral displays for Epcot festivals. This farm also grows some of the food for animals on exhibit. The area is affectionately known as the 100-acre woods, though it's closer to 90 acres. If you're on the elephant tour, your bus will pull down a road that leads to an observation platform on the backside of the safari enclosure. When this tour first started as a standalone experience, it was presented with a script that explored how research at Animal Kingdom improved the lives of elephants and their habitat in Africa. This past month, shortly after the experience reopened, much of that script seemed to be gone, and the experience was a 45-minute viewing and photograph opportunity from the viewing platform. It was also a time to chat somewhat informally with one of the people who cared for the elephants. Personally, I like this approach far better than the half-memorized script with its various concept points. If you're interested in taking photographs of the elephants and the safari area, this might be an interesting opportunity for you. You are given free access to the viewing platform to move as you wish. If you want, you can even bring a backpack with lenses, as the viewing platform is cleared for guest photography. Even if you aren't interested in photography, from the Element Observation platform, you can get a sense of how close you are to other areas of the resort, specifically Hollywood Studios. The roads in and out of Animal Kingdom aren't on a grid. They curve and turn, creating the illusion that this park is further from the rest of the resort. But as the bird flies, it's about 2.5 miles from the studios. So if you've ever wondered why the studios has far less dramatic fireworks than the Magic Kingdom or Epcot, it's this. Larger, or more specifically, louder fireworks disturb the animals. When testing new fireworks shows at the studios, the animal care team visually monitors the animals. They also check their feces for elevated levels of hormones, which indicate stress. When the Star Wars A Galactic Spectacular fireworks were first tested, animal caretakers felt the shells were too disruptive for the animals. The pyro team then needed to swap out shells to bring down the decibels. But overall, I do think the other tour option here is the better experience. The Elephant Encounter is mostly arranged as a guest-focused viewing location. Up Close with Rhinos takes you back into the rhino barn to talk with those who care for the animals. I should point out, though, that this tour is entirely backstage, and as such, there's no photography with the rhinos. I've done this tour multiple times, including this past month. It's one of the most difficult experiences to book on Disney property, as to protect the animals from undue stress, tours are limited to one fairly small group each day. Tour spaces fill up moments after they open. As with other tours, they presently book out 60 days. This tour takes you back to a cluster of working barns, the elephants, the cheetahs, and of course the rhinos. It's truly a backstage experience. Keepers discuss the challenges of keeping these large mammals from their diet to daily care to their routine in the barn and out on the savannah. If you want an interesting story, ask one of the keepers about the time a juvenile was able to slip out between those thick enclosure bars, they're called bollards, into a temporary freedom. But the centerpiece of this experience is an opportunity to pet an adult rhino, in a sense, to commune by touch with these majestic animals. You approach the bollards. These are those extremely thick bars capable of managing an animal 5,000 pounds or larger. And then you reach inside to pet the rhino while a handler offers them a treat. Their skin is a couple centimeters thick, covered with sparse bristles. Typically in these encounters, unless they've recently been bathed, their skin is covered by a crust of dried mud, making it feel even thicker. You can run your hand along its sides over thick folds. The animals have to be willing to be petted, so this part of the experience is not guaranteed. But keepers can't remember a single tour in which guests weren't able to touch a rhino. Beyond this, the barn is a place where mother rhinos remain with their calves. So if you're lucky, in the background you'll see a baby. This leaves us with one last experience to explore. The most expensive and longest of the backstage tours in the Animal Kingdom area is Wild Africa Trek. This is primarily a hiking tour that moves behind, around, and above the Kilimanjaro Safari area. Before the pandemic, Africa Trek was staffed by the most experienced guides on the Animals, Science, and Environments team. But one procedural shift that happened as the tours moved to reopen post-COVID was that all guides were cross-trained on both the 1-hour experiences, that is for rhinos and elephants, and the 3-hour experience for the trek. From what I've seen, the main guides still have years of experience on the savannah and know animals by name and understand many of their personal histories. This tour has been around since January 2011. The tour is typically offered early mornings and midday and includes a light meal. Many years ago, the food offerings were different between the breakfast and lunch tours, with the lunch being slightly better than breakfast. Now the meal is the same. As such, the best time to take this tour is the morning, as early as possible, as not only are the animals more active, but the temperature is cooler, the low lights are far more inviting for photography and viewing, and as you enter Animal Kingdom, you experience an empty or near-empty park. Before we jump in, here are the basics. Unlike other offerings, this is a modestly active tour. You suit up with a mesh vest and a leg harness. Cell phones are clipped to your chest. You can take a camera so long as it's strapped to you, such as with a neck strap. The trails are unpaved and sloped. There are many exposed tree roots, so you need to watch where you're going. Though it's supposed to be Africa, you move through a canopy of palms and oaks, which creates the pleasant illusion of a safari with plants that thrive in Central Florida. During the walking portion, there are two main viewing stops. You stop on a small cliff that overlooks the hippo pool where a handler feeds them. When the tour premiered over a decade ago, this was called a cliffhang, but basically, guests are tethered to a support lead that prevents them from wandering too close to that cliff edge. The experience does allow you to move very close to the hippo enclosure. Watermelon is their favorite food, but most of the time they simply receive romaine. The hippos are trained to come to the side of the pond through an audio cue. As their regular diet is hay and grains, they are still interested in the lettuce. At the viewing points, you can talk with handlers about recent research done in the park. For example, as the hippos are related to dolphins, not long ago, a graduate student researcher proposed an experiment on the Disney property in which he set mics underwater to see if hippos could perform echolocation like dolphins. For days, the hippos were given a treat in the water, along with a sound cue. But then, at night, in dark water, they were given the same sound cues indicating carrots were in the water. The mics then picked up clicking sounds, as though the animals were using sound to locate their food, suggesting that hippos could echolocate in a similar manner to dolphins. The other viewing location is after a set of rope bridges, supposedly in poor repair, arranged over the crocodile pool. Though the crocs all have microchips in their tails to identify them, they also have names such as Jabba and Lefty. Years ago, I was told that one croc got a new name, Mr. Evil, after he had lost all the digits on one hand except for his pinky. This past month, when I asked if Mr. Evil was still in the group, I was told that since my last visit, the crocs, all of them males, had had a few more tussles, and now there was more than one croc with only one digit on his right hand. For this viewing experience, as with the hippos, you can walk right up to the edge of the overlook, as with your harness, you are tethered to a restraining rail. The remaining portion of the tour is covered by an open bed truck where you move around the familiar Kilimanjaro safari route, pulling off the trail a few times so guests can take photos. The tour concludes in a savannah viewing location where a chilled lunch is served in metal tiffins. These are mostly finger foods, such as chicken wraps, pita and hummus, olives and gherkins, and iced curry shrimp. But as perhaps you can tell, I was more taken by the experience with the rhinos. The trip to the Rhino Barn is truly a journey into the inner workings of Animal Kingdom as an active zoo. Though you can glimpse backstage areas while on Wild Africa Trek, the focus remains on areas that have been cultivated to offer a themed experience, over suspension bridges and along viewing areas. The location for the meal at the end of the tour is lovely, as you enjoy picturesque views of the open savanna, but it lacks the authenticity of moving through actual work areas and listening to handlers talk about how they manage the animals. Also, on both Caring for Giants and Up Close with Rhinos, you pass those enormous LED light boards, which give you a sense of how technology, art, and horticulture combine to transform a man-made construction into something that imitates the fluidity of nature. Of the three experiences inside the theme park, Caring for Giants, which is the elephant experience at $35, Up Close with Rhinos at $45, or Wild Africa Trek at $199, I'd rank them in terms of value and personal enjoyment in this order. Up top easily, Up Close with Rhinos. Second, Wild Africa Trek. And last, Caring for Giants. They are all enjoyable tours. But partly what interests me in these experiences is the ability to step behind the theme park and explore elements of animal care and area design with authenticity. Plus, petting a rhino is pretty cool. As of May 2020, when I'm writing this, there are no definite plans to bring back nighttime safaris anytime soon. After a 2-year hiatus, drivers are no longer trained for the Sunset Tours. There's also a communication campaign Disney would need to mount to explain to guests that daytime safaris are far better for a first visit with the nighttime experience working better as a variation on a familiar theme. These things, of course, can be worked out, but the lights remain there, just outside of the savannah, like a few other elements of theme park life before the pandemic. Beautiful things that are in a holding pattern, waiting for the world to inch back a little closer to normal before, like a wide panel of citrus embers, they glow again as safari trucks move out onto artificial dirt roads, looking for animals shortly after dark. I'll be back next week with a new episode. At least at this point, I think our next episode will focus on shoes and coffee and mermaids and other strange stories that relate to Epcot. If you're interested in episodes that explore out-of-the-way lesser-known experiences at the Florida resort like the one today, you'll find 11 such episodes like this on Bandcamp, posted over the last 3 or 4 years. Just look for episodes that begin with the capital letters AGD. If you're planning a trip, you'll hopefully find a few things there that will make your vacation more memorable, and you'll also hear some stories about how the resort is designed and managed. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories that relate to the history of the Disney studio and parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly Bandcamp subscriber. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.